Offence Archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Sunday Talk.
Good talk.
News Talk.
Talk Radio.
The Tice Man cometh.
Stir up your Sundays with Richard Tice.
From global current affairs to the issues that hit closer to home.
Richard Tice on Talk Radio.
And a very good morning to all. Welcome to Tice Talk here just after 10 o'clock. It's Sunday the 20th of March. And once again, we've got an action-packed, full-on show with a big new surprise. Make sure you listen in to that shortly. We're going to be talking obviously about Ukraine, the latest humanitarian efforts, the military prospects going forwards. I've got to talk about P&O, what I think is an absolute corporate outrage, a real scandal. And then looking forward this week, taxes. Is the Chancellor going to tinker with them? Is he going to increase them? Or is he going to tweak them downwards a little bit? We've got to be talking about that, as well as intimidation and bullying by those nice people, yes, the greenies, the eco-zealots. And then I want to talk about China and its role in the whole Russia and Ukraine crisis. Why hasn't it condemned what's been going on? We've got some great guests. We've got MPs, we've got experts, and we've got other people who've been bullied over green issues, over shale gas. Stay with us and make sure you listen to everything that's coming up. And my big question is, Ukraine, should Putin be given a way out, a sort of exit ramp in order to end the war early, or must he be seen to fail, as our Foreign Secretary Liz Truss indicated over the last couple of days? Your input, give us a call, 0344 499 1000. Text us 87222 using the word talk, or tweet us at Talk Radio. Your input makes for a better show. And of course, you can watch us live on the app or on YouTube, via the website, all sorts of ways to get involved, to watch, and to give us your views and your input. I'm here for the next 3 hours. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk Radio.
Richard Tice on Talk Radio.
Wow, there we are. What do you think? The intro to my Sunday sermon from the pulpit here at Talk Radio Towers. Give us your views on the intro, whether you like that or whether you'd want something else or nothing at all. My Sunday sermon. I'm going to focus on one word, dependent. It's actually probably one of my least favourite words, because in a sense, if you're dependent on something, it's risky in so many areas, so many walks of life. If you're dependent on booze, fags, drugs, it's not good. If you're dependent, think about it, on just one bank account, that's fine until that bank has a problem. If you're dependent on the hard drive in your computer, rather than having a backup in the cloud or elsewhere on a separate hard drive, all of these things, if you're dependent, you're exposed, you're vulnerable. Likewise, if you're dependent on subsidies to make something work, that's not ideal, and it makes you complacent. And if a company is dependent on one client or two clients, that's not good. If that client decides to go elsewhere, you can be massively exposed. And the reality is, something that's critical to you, don't be dependent on one source. In my view, you want to be independent. And the same is true running a country. And let's look, of course, what we've seen in recent weeks, what we've really had a massive wake-up call. that, of course, European nations have been massively dependent on Russia for natural gas. Italy, Germany, some 40% of their energy coming from Russia. And therefore, if it's critical to your functioning, and yet you're dependent, essentially, on an autocratic, bullying dictator. I would argue that the UK, we found out we were overly dependent on China, for example, with PPE at the beginning of the COVID crisis. We were dependent on India almost exclusively for the manufacture of vaccines and paracetamol. We were dependent on Denmark for the production of insulin. And as a nation, for critical things, items of sort of critical national infrastructure, we need to be independent, not dependent on others. And we can be independent in respect of energy. We've got all our gas in the North Sea under our feet. Take the example of Jersey. When they had their fishing row with France, a French minister threatened to cut off the electricity to Jersey. You see the risks of being dependent on others, even those you think might be your friends. But the great joy, of course, of the Brexit slogan, "Take back control," is that it's the absolute reverse of being dependent on others. So take back control is about independence away from Brussels. We're not dependent on them for their rules or their subsidies or their directions. And yet EU nations that are in the Eurozone, they're dependent on the European Central Bank to set interest rates, even though it might be totally wrong and inappropriate for their particular economic needs at the time. And we're learning that many countries in Africa are overly dependent on Ukraine and Russia for the export of grain to those countries. And that, I fear, is going to manifest itself in coming weeks. And the UK, 40 years ago, we used to produce about 80% of the food that we consume. That figure now, I believe, is less than 60%. And again, with new farming techniques, vertical farming, all sorts of new technology, actually, we need to get back up to a much higher percentage of producing our own food. I would also argue, for example, that we're not only are we too dependent on China, but what happens if China invades Taiwan or squeezes Taiwan so that it has to accede to China? We're overly dependent on cheap Chinese goods and we need to be looking elsewhere. Likewise, the UK is dependent on a Chinese billionaire to keep the lights on in London and the South East. UK universities are way too dependent on grants, research grants, donations from Chinese entities, and arguably, are universities too dependent on Chinese students? Diversity is a good thing unless you become overly dependent, and that's the point. And COVID, we learned the government became totally dependent on one group of scientists. And likewise, on net zero, the government has relied on one scientific consensus, when actually there are others with very different views. And the government's making itself, with its net zero policies, dependent on one source of energy, electricity. Not great if you've got 25 million gas domestic boilers that don't work with electricity. So you see, being dependent is not good. And I think this government is being totally foolish in increasing its dependency on electricity, increasing its dependency on renewables, when actually it's ignoring the diverse range of other energy sources. For example, tidal power, the gas, the treasure under our feet, accelerating nuclear. It needs to be doing much more. I mean, what if, for example, just imagine if the net zero consensus thinking got it wrong? Wouldn't be ideal. And those of us that have gone too far would look very stupid indeed. What are you dependent on? What do you think the country is overly dependent on? My view is, the gospel according to Tice is, don't be dependent, take back control. and here endeth my Sunday sermon. Give us a call, 0344 499 1000, with your views on dependency. Are you happy being dependent on China or a single source of energy? Maybe you think that encourages friendship and relationship and global trade, or maybe not. Or text us at Talk Radio, tweet us, let's get that right. Text us 87222 using the word talk, or tweet at Talk Radio. Coming up, we're going to be talking to the Conservative MP for Beckenham, Bob Stewart, about what's going on militarily in Ukraine, his forecasts for the coming weeks. Stay with us. You've been listening to Tice Talk here at Talk Radio.
Bold Talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Talk Radio.
Bold Brave, ballsy.
Made to make your mouth water.
A radiant force of argument.
Shape up and talk.
Freedom of speech.
Accept no substitutes.
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here on Talk Radio, and the text messages and the tweets are pouring in. Here's one from Pete who says, my heart says Putin must be stopped at all costs, but my head says give him a way out which somehow saves Ukraine. Interesting thoughts there from Pete. We're just waiting for Bob Stewart to get himself comfortable. He's parking up to join us on the call. So we're quickly going to go to Daniel in Surrey. Good morning, Daniel.
Morning, Rich. Do you know what I think we should do in this country? I think we should take a stance. People like P&O ferries, every single British person should, if they sack those British staff for cheaper alternatives elsewhere, I think every single British person should stop using P&O ferries.
That's right. No, it's a very good point. I mean, ultimately, the customer is king, and if the customers take their business elsewhere, then as you say, Daniel, they'll soon come round, I think.
I'll give you an example, Richard. I've not bought HP sauce for over a decade. So Houses of Parliament sauce, they sacked loads of people in Birmingham and move production of Houses of Parliament sauce to Holland. And I quite like the stuff, but I've not bought it in a decade. And I can't help feeling that if everyone in the country was like me, we wouldn't. What they do is, if nobody bought HP sauce anymore, they'd relocate back to Britain, and there'd be 800 more jobs in Birmingham.
Well, there you are.
If no one used P&O ferries, all of those staff would be re-employed. We need to vote with our feet, Richard.
Daniel, you're absolutely right. I'm going to be talking about P&O later on in the show because I think it's an outrage. I think it's a scandal, and I think that massive pressure has got to be brought on it, including from the government that also spends money investing with contracts with P&O. Daniel, thank you very much for that. First caller of the day. Keep the calls coming in 0344 499 1000. I think we have got Colonel Bob Stewart, Conservative MP for Buckingham and former UN commanding officer in Bosnia in the early 1990s. Bob, a very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us. And thanks for pulling over to talk and share your thoughts with my listeners. So, in a sense, day by day, week by week, this hideous war, this appalling atrocities, this sort of war of attrition goes on. I'm just really interested, Bobby, in your thoughts as to how the Russian military commanders, how they might be feeling this is going relative to their ambitions, and just with your experience, how difficult now is it for them?
Firstly, they were really shocked. They thought they were much better than they were. They thought it would be a kind of a blitzkrieg, and that the whole shebang would be over in 3 days. That came as a tremendous shock to them because, frankly, they were in a far worse state than even they thought. So they were in shock. Putin must be going mad about their lack of progress. And they just keep doing the same thing all the time, which is just keep hammering on. They have got a real problem with what's called combat supplies, petrol, oil, lubricants, things like ammunition, weapon systems, even water and medical supplies. They just, their system, their administration has apparently cracked up.
Which, of course...
So that's what they thought they were going to get. What they've got now is a slogging war against people who are hugely motivated, whereas their troops are not.
And I guess that is the fear, isn't it? That if they haven't got the logistics, and logistics is key to keeping any military force, any army going, if they're struggling with that, which they clearly are, essentially what we're seeing is a race to using ever bigger, ever more hideous, ever faster missiles. For example, suggestions over the last couple of days, they've used this hypersonic missile. Do you see that continuing in this sort of elongated war of attrition, Bob?
Absolutely, definitely. And the big worry, and we've got to be quite clear on this, the use of chemical weapons is absolutely forbidden. But they've used them before in Aleppo in Syria, and that is a very quick way to end a siege. Now, what the Russians seem to be doing now is hoping to sort of invest Kiev, take Kiev, and if they take Kiev, of course, they've fundamentally got the government, unless it's moved out to another part of the country, which I suspect they're thinking of doing if necessary. But the fact of the matter is, the Russians will increase the pressure. They will go for the big bang, if you like, and they will increase the misery of the population of Ukraine. I mean, it's just an appalling situation. We all know that. And the situation requires a way out. Now, Putin's way out. What is Putin's way out? Well, he's kind of suggested it insofar as he wants to keep, Luhansk, Donetsk, and the Crimea, and he wants to neutralize Ukraine, and he wants to ensure that Ukraine doesn't join NATO. Well, those are his basic demands, but why did he go beyond the limits of those areas? I don't know. I don't trust the Russians. They said they weren't going to invade, and they did. So how can you trust what the Russians are saying? Because they have actually proved to be liars.
So, Bob, the longer this goes on, that possibly makes it more likely that he might be tempted to use a chemical weapon to try and bring it to a close. But is that essentially a red line? I mean, we talked about a red line in Aleppo, and then actually it turned out not to be a red line. But do you think that's a red line for the West now? And if so, what would be the consequence of that in your mind?
Well, sadly, I don't think it is a red line, because they've proved already, when the American president said there was a red line in Aleppo and the red line was breached and nothing happened. Sadly, I don't think it is. But frankly, I also hope that somehow or other these talks that are going on at so-called high level might well result in at least some kind of ceasefire. Let's stop the killing as the first option. If we can stop the war, that at least stops people dying, and frankly, that must be the first objective, and then start talking about other things. Ukrainians are very, very against the idea of losing territory, and that means, Luhansk and Donetsk, and indeed the Crimea. They actually feel that they might even win this war. They might even do it because they're going to grind the Russians into stalemate. And it seems to be largely that at the moment in large parts of the country.
And I guess that becomes actually ever more dangerous. It is that the longer it goes on, the more it looks like that Russia cannot win, the more likely he's going to use ever bigger weapons, more hideous weapons, in order to try and force Ukraine to concede more in the talks, I imagine.
Absolutely. And who is actually in control in Russia? Is it Putin? It seems to me it is. And if he's slightly, as some people suggest, mad, but don't guarantee that, the one thing is that as dictators get more and more desperate, they do more and more crazy things. I mean, it was crazy for him to invade Ukraine, but he did it.
Yes.
All these armchair strategists like me all said, well, I don't think he'd do that. He would be mad to do that, but he's done it. So, I wouldn't trust the experts. No one knows what's going on really inside the Kremlin. No one knows what's going inside Putin's head. He's made a grievous mistake. He's probably realizing that now, and therefore he's likely, as all bullies and all despots do, likely to hit out hard, and that is the worry.
And we have to stand up to bullies. I think that's one of the big lessons of this. But given how badly the Russian military forces on the ground are performing, does that reduce dramatically the likelihood of them trying to go into another sovereign nation after Ukraine?
Yes, I think it does, actually. I mean, what's really happening extremely well is the way the low-level infantrymen in Ukraine are fighting. They are stopping armour coming in with anti-tank missiles and this sort of new generation light anti-tank weapon, which we provided, by the way. We've also trained up 20,000 Ukrainian servicemen since 2014, I mean, I said it in the House of Commons last week. To be honest, it's wonderful that Ukraine has put up such resistance, but some small percentage of that success may well be down to the fact that the British Minister of Defence and British soldiers have been out there in Ukraine training 20,000 Ukrainians and equipping them with weapons that they can resist, defensive weapons such as the new generation light anti-tank weapons, Stinger missiles, that sort of thing.
That's my understanding too, Bob. Just finally, do you think that that Biden and our own Prime Minister, by constantly saying that NATO won't go in, is that actually weakening our position relative to the alternative approach of saying we keep all options on the table, for example, with chemical weapons?
Well, the fact of the matter is NATO is an alliance of 30 nations. In order for NATO to go in, all 30 have got to agree to go in, and I can tell you they wouldn't. So it's a statement of fact. They wouldn't go in. I mean, all options on the table. NATO can't say that. Only individual countries can say that because NATO wouldn't agree to say that, as I understand it.
Indeed. Bob Stewart, that's very helpful indeed. Thank you so much. That's Colonel Bob Stewart, Conservative MP for Beckenham, former UN commanding officer in Bosnia, with his thoughts about the latest military situation in Ukraine, which is going on, and a long war of attrition looks ahead of us. Stay with us after the news. We're going to be talking to Justin Urquhart Stewart, business commentator, city expert, about the knock-on effects from this and the sanctions, about what might happen here in the UK, the price that we pay for those sanctions. So stay with us here at Tice Talk on Talk Radio.
Bold Talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Richard Tice on Talk Radio.
A first magnitude star of common sense.
The Tice Man.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
Richard Tice.
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk, and the tweets and messages are coming in. We've got a nice tweet here from DM who says the sermon intro organ, the organ piece was nice, liked that. Then says, why are fools running the country? You talk sense. Thank you very much indeed. Another one here actually from, who is it? Sir Max, who says, I'm fed up with commentators saying Putin needs a way out, sanctions needs to tighten, and I think increase arms supply. The Russian people need to see Putin lose. Interesting. And keep the sanctions until he is out of Ukraine in its entirety. Well, I think that's the big point, isn't it? That actually, for me, this only ends when there is regime change in Russia and that Putin is out. But only that can only happen in Russia, and that may be, whether that's months, it could be years, it could be a decade plus away. We just don't know. Another text message here. Oh my God, chemical weapons, this is shocking. Well, you know, there is evidence that Russia was involved in using chemical weapons in Syria, in Aleppo, and that's the fear, that actually if the situation continues, if the military forces of Russia continue to be bogged down in Ukraine, that they resort to ever bigger, ever more shocking weapons. So keep those thoughts and texts coming in. We're going to try and go to our next guest, Justin Urquhart Stewart, who I'm hoping is with us on the line. No, we're not going to go to Justin. We're going to go to Dave in Essex. Good morning, Dave. How are you doing?
Oh, good morning, Richard. I'm grateful for you taking my call. I'd like to rejoin you on your point of dependency. And you went to great lengths to, outline the dependency of bad things, but dependency can be a good thing as well. Now, let's take the media, for example. Now, the media is the only way the public can get a fair and balanced idea of what's going on in all this, craziness at the moment. So we are dependent on the media to give us a fair and balanced view of what's going on, not an opinion, but the news.
That's right, but of course, with the media, there are different aspects of the media, aren't there, Dave? You can watch different broadcast outlets, you can read different newspapers, so there is a bit of competition. Sometimes they do adopt a consensus, such as on COVID, but you have at least got a choice. You're not really dependent.
Well, to that point, I'd like to clarify my disappointment, because when they cancelled the RT network, the Russian network, I was kind of disappointed, because in my view, in a fair and balanced country that have got adults, the voting public, I think we should be allowed to hear both sides of the argument, even if the other guy is talking trash. That will enforce the truth. But I'll cite Rousseau when he said, I may not agree with everything you say, but I'll fight to the death for your permission to say it.
Absolutely right, Dave. Well, if you listen later on in the show when I talk about the intimidation and bullying that we receive because we want to talk about net zero and shale gas, you'll see that actually it's quite difficult even here in the UK. Dave, thank you so much for that call from Essex. On the line now, we've got Justin Urquhart Stewart, who's the co-founder of the Regionally Investment Platform and an expert on financial matters, city matters. Justin, very good morning. Thanks for joining us on Tice Talk. So we've got these sanctions, obviously, that I think have surprised Putin and Russia in their sort of severity, in the unity across the EU, the UK, and the West at large. I guess one of the questions that I really wanted to discuss with you, Justin, is the extent to which these sanctions are going to hit us here in the UK, the price of it, and how long, in a sense, because these sanctions may have to go on for potentially for years, and therefore
potentially they will be damaging to all. There's no free party here, I'm afraid. And quite rightly, that these sanctions have been targeted at the most sensitive area for Russia, and that is the bank accounts. Particularly, it's not so much SWIFT, the payments messaging system, but each bank has to have a correspondent bank. So if it's paying its dollars, it has to go through that bank account.
just freeze those few dollar bank accounts, and effectively, therefore, you cause huge problem for Russia. But that also, of course, will impact on anything else that we're doing, because in terms of trade, which you've talked about before, obviously the dependence that Germany and Western Europe has on Russian gas, and to an extent oil as well, and of course a lot of those rare earths that are certainly quite prevalent in Ukraine. The more that carries on, the more that will hurt us as well. But possibly the biggest global threat to this is because, as we mentioned in terms of Ukraine and Russia, come to that, being the breadbasket of Europe, and of course as is America and Canada, but other areas, and they do a lot of exports, particularly to third world, and that will impact directly on some of the African countries. And if you mean that they don't have enough food, you end up with political instability and therefore effectively breeding further angst, aggression, and potential local wars as well. So this is not just a simple sanction system against a few bank accounts.
No, and so actually there is going to be a price, and you talked quite rightly about food, and that'll create food inflation. Inflation of all sorts of foodstuffs. And also, of course, Russia itself, you just touched on rare earth metals, but, Russia actually does have significant quantities, in some cases almost being dominant in certain rare earth metals that we all use in our industrial processes and modern technology. And that, of course, is another massive risk for us.
It is, and of course, over the years, since we actually saw the falling of the Berlin Wall and the USSR, we've had almost been asleep at the wheel, assuming that, well, it's all finished now, that's fine, we don't need to spend so much on defence, we're now going to be in a nice cuddly world where we all trade. But of course, that is what Mrs. Merkel was doing with Russia by having, let's have an agreement whereby we take Russian gas. Well, and on the basis they're always going to be friends, that's fine. Until you're not, and then you're not fine. You're on the hook. She thought she was binding Russia into the capitalist system. What in fact she's doing is binding us, effectively economically, closer to Russia. So this is going to be, I'm afraid, very painful. The other thing to remember, though, is the Russian economy. Russia, to state the stunningly obvious, is huge, but its economy is not. If you take the value of its GDP, the value of its economy overall, it's round about half that of the United Kingdom. We're hardly a large country. So it is a country which is very dependent upon exporting of minerals and hydrocarbons. It hasn't broadened out. Its economy has been in significant deficit for several years. Its population is stable, if not shrinking. So this is not a good picture. And, of course, Putin does not have reserves he can access very easily. Why? Well, because they were in the banks that have been frozen. So He wanted a short war. He can't have a short war. But equally, we also want a short war because it will materially affect us.
Now, Justin, obviously lots of people in the city have earned huge sums from advising oligarchs, from advising Russian companies looking to list on the stock exchange, the lawyers, the accountants, the bankers, the PR people. And in a sense, all of that is going to stop for a long time. Do these people in the city, do they understand and accept that and recognise that, this is the price of making sure that there is regime change in Russia?
Whether they accept it or not, it's the reality. They should have realised this well in advance. Money laundering and London's reputation for money laundering is not new. It was the biggest open secret that everybody knew. London grad, being able to ship money through and encouraged by politicians. We won't have to search too far back to politicians encouraging investment into London. It's money coming in here. It's helping us, not just football clubs. But we all know the stories over the Russian mansions in Kensington and things like that. But how has the city realised it? Well, frankly, they should have been aware because there were very clear rules on money laundering. I suspect an awful lot of them are now finding they were bending them.
Well, what infuriates me is that those of us UK citizens trying to just go about our normal daily lives, if you register with an estate agent to buy a home, you have to you have to show your know your client documents and where your money came from, and so we all try and be very diligent. How is it that big firms in the city were able to circumvent these rules and take on Russian clients with fairly dubious origins of money and just carry on like this?
And the truth be told, because they thought they could get away with it. Also, in terms of how they were structured, if they were rewarded by assets under management, and if they could prove that the money was coming through a reliable source, i.e. maybe a British bank in the Cayman Islands or something like that, without having to dig any further. Well, I'm afraid that's just irresponsible. That is not good enough. You were supposed to go deeper than that. So I'm afraid there are dirty hands here, and people who've been able to get away with it. So to an extent, you could also say it's not just the banks and the investment companies, also the regulator seemed to be happy to go along with it. When was the last time you saw anybody practically being done for any of this?
Well,
and you can see with the reputation of the city with the banking crisis, at least the Americans have a certain theatre to it. They take away the people concerned in handcuffs and put them in a police car. Here, it's almost socially acceptable.
Yes.
But it's not. And totally unacceptable. And bad for the City of London, because that's one of our main breadwinners in the country.
It's bad for the city, bad for the reputation, and it's not a good look either when the Prime Minister is giving peerages to the son of a former KGB officer and oligarch who happens to own the Evening Standard. Justin Urquhart-Stewart, thank you so much for your thoughts on those finance matters, the impact of sanctions around the world and also here in the UK. The tweets are coming in, the messages. We've got one from Lynn from Staines who says, we're dependent on our politicians to be intelligent and work for the country and the people. That's not worked out very well. Interesting, there we are. Whereas Paul from Saffron Walden, Paul says, self-dependence is so obviously good. So what are we not being told about the reasons for being reliant on other countries for energy and manufacturing? Her Majesty's government could give incentives for start-ups of new business for this, surely. Interesting thoughts. Well, I think we are all learning a huge amount. It's a massive, massive wake-up call for all of us. Coming up after the break, we're going to be talking to Andre Walker, who's going to join me here in the studio, the broadcaster journalist, about his recent visit to the Ukraine border and his plans to help the humanitarian effort going forward. Give us a call, 0344 499 1000. Stay with us here on Tice Talk at Talk.
Bold Talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Talk Radio.
At last, a radio station that's on your side.
Arm yourself with knowledge.
Listen or don't listen.
Wide Angle Radio.
Let's broaden our minds.
Talk Radio.
The home of common sense. Now on the telly.
Welcome back to Tice Talk. We're still in the first hour of the show. We've been focusing on Ukraine. Keep those calls and tweets and messages coming in. And we're getting the full range of messages. One here, which is a text message, said, "Morning, Richard. Loving your show," which is great. Thank you very much. Whereas another text message here says, "Talk. Listen to this pompous prat." Well, all I would say is that's probably not the most constructive message to help encourage debate. But there we are. You get a full range of views. And we're going to be now talking to my next guest, Andre Walker, with his views about how we can all help and what he's doing to help with the humanitarian effort in Ukraine and on the Polish and Hungarian borders. Andre, a very good morning to you. Thanks for joining me. So you've been pretty busy, it seems, in recent weeks and coming up with your huge efforts. You've just come back, haven't you, from the Ukrainian border? Just tell us a bit about what your future plans are.
Now, I think I've lost you, Richard.
I can see you loud and clear. Are you there? I think he's lost me. Andre's lost me. We'll try and get him back. Maybe he's either en route somewhere to gain some more provisions, some more supplies to get ready to take back to the Ukrainian border, because he's actually, I think he's fundraising for some armoured vehicles in order to help take supplies into Ukraine itself because of the risks of shelling by the Russian forces. And we look forward to hearing some thoughts on that. Give us a call, 0344 499 1000. We've got one more interesting tweet here. Says NATO won't go in because they would then be the cause of possibly World War III. Well, in a sense, of course, that is the main reluctance. And, of course, Ukraine is not a NATO country. And therefore, we're supplying weapons. But we don't want to trigger Putin. That's been NATO's judgment. And as Bob Stewart quite rightly said, there are 30 countries in NATO. Now, I wonder if we've got... whether or not we've got Andre Walker back. We haven't got that. We've lost that line to Andre, but we have up in Ilkley got Craig. Good morning, Craig. How are you doing?
I'm very well, Richard. Good morning, and hope this Sunday's finding you well. So we spoke last week about the scheme of control in Hong Kong. In fact, just jogs your memory a little bit. And in this past week, I work in a global team for a very large organisation. We've got colleagues all over Switzerland, Poland, India, and China. So I was just asking my colleague in India, and he's a young lad. He works from home with his wife, no kids, use gas for cooking. So they've got 2 laptops, 2 screens, aircon on and off in the day. They sit in the evening and watch Netflix. So a consumption profile very similar to anybody living in any major city in an apartment. And I said, out of interest, what's your power bill for the month? He went, £7.
Yes, if only our power bills were that cheap. And did he say what? So therefore, they're not worried about energy bills, unlike ourselves. I mean, you've probably seen your bills go through the roof, like everybody else, I guess, Craig.
I have seen them go through the roof, and I said to him, what's the energy mix? How has it generated the power? He says, don't know. We've just got bigger problems to worry about in India. We don't really care too much about how the power's generated. But £7, £100 a year for electricity. I mean, that's just shocking. And, we're all led to believe that we are, subject to global commodity prices. So if that's the case, you think electricity and gas would be the same price all over the world, but clearly it's
yes, of course, it depends how it's generated, where it's generated, and with what fuel source. My understanding, but others may correct me if I get this wrong, I think they still use quite a lot of coal-fired power stations. They have got some renewables, but also gas-fired, and they import a lot of oil. So I think they've got a range, and they realise that actually cheap energy it's the most fundamental thing to drive an economy, whether it's for keeping people warm domestically, or indeed for businesses to be able to grow and thrive and employ people and therefore fuel the economy.
Exactly, and if you're a high-tech manufacturer, for example, Thailand, they used to make a lot of hard drives, Western Digital and Seagate. They need a very good, stable source of energy to be able to keep those production lines, in flow year round.
Absolutely,
that's a trick, right?
Cheap energy, Craig, and we've got it here. We've got it here in the UK. We should be using it. I keep calling it the treasure under our feet. It's worth trillions of pounds, and it infuriates me that too many people are leaving it there. Craig, I thank you so much for your thoughts. Keep them coming in. Keep the calls coming in. We're going to head down from Ilkley to Ashford. I think that's Ashford in Kent, where Lenny is patiently waiting. Morning, Lenny.
Good morning, Richard.
How are you doing? What's on your mind this morning, Lenny?
Well, what is on my mind, and that is, what the president of Ukraine wanted. He was entitled to do that in a perfect world, but what he did is he's not a diplomat, and I think he doesn't live in the real world, and I think that the EU and NATO have led him astray, and they should be more diplomatic so we can at least get the world finished.
You think we've led President Zelensky astray, do you?
Well, I think what it was, I think what it is, he had the full, he was full entitled to want to be part of Europe and part of NATO, but he was poking the fire. Very, very dangerous.
Yes, but Lenny, he is the elected president of a sovereign, independent nation that can make its own choices. Surely.
I know. That's what I'm saying. He has got the right to do that in a perfect world. But when you've got a powerful bully next door to you who's capable of doing what he's doing, you have to slow down and look at common sense.
Well, that's an interesting thought. It is a balance. I agree with you, Lenny, that you've got to sort of weigh up. But if you don't stand up to a bully, then they're going to continue to walk over you. It's the same in the school playground, and we're seeing it in the world of geopolitics. Lenny, thank you very much from Ashford with his thoughts. That maybe, had the West actually, the EU and the UK and the US, had we slightly overpromised to Zelensky? What are your thoughts? 0344 499 1000. Keep those messages and tweets coming in. An interesting text message here. Richard, who is holding to account Cameron, Osborne, Johnson, and the many others who've received favours from the oligarchs? Well, that's a really interesting question. We might talk about that later. We haven't been able to get hold of Andre Walker. Hopefully we'll get him back later in the show. But coming up in the second hour, we're going to be talking to the MP, Robert Halfon, about reducing fuel taxes, his campaign for that, ahead of the spring statement from the Chancellor this week. Stay with us. It's Tice Talk here at Talk Radio.
Bold Talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Morning Talk.
Sunday Talk.
Talk Radio.
Richard Tice. Powered by Debate.
Sunday morning with the Tice Man. Richard Tice. The heart of a common sense Sunday.
Richard Tice.
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk. We are now into the second hour of my 3-hour show. We talk about the big issues of the day and the week, and indeed the month. And of course, Ukraine is one of those, but you can't please everybody. A tweet has come in here from Dave from Talk Geordie. I wonder where that is. Have a guess. Dave says, when did Talk Radio change its name to Radio Ukraine? Well, Ukraine and the impact of that is one of the massive global issues. It's the big global issues, and the impact reverberates everywhere, including here in the UK, the cost of living crisis and what we can do about that. And that's what we're going to be focusing on here in the second hour, because prices are going up for our energy bills and, of course, our fuel bills. Yes, if you've got a petrol or diesel car you've been filling up recently, it's starting to hurt ever more as we approach fairly standard to be almost £100 per fill up. And are we approaching £2 a gallon? And what can we do about it? Well, this week we've got the Chancellor's mini statement. Lots of people are weighing in, lobbying on the Chancellor, one of whom is, of course, the Conservative MP for Harlow and the Chair of the Education Select Committee, Robert Halfon, who is joining me now, who's put forward a letter signed by some of the big hitters in the Conservative Party asking for a cut in fuel duty. Robert, very good morning. Thanks for joining us again on Tice Talk. So just tell us a little bit about what you think the Chancellor could now do with fuel duty. You've obviously put forward a very significant letter to him. What level would you like to see him reduce the fuel duty to?
Well, I've campaigned as MP. I got elected in 2010 for nearly 12 years on fuel duty, and to the government's credit, after a long campaign with the Sun newspaper, with Fair Fuel UK and others, the government have leased frozen fuel duty for a number of years. But we're reaching crisis point. We're heading for a de facto lockdown because millions of people will not be able to afford to go out of the house because they can't afford to drive their car. Millions of businesses won't work because they can't afford the costs of transportation. And I've been told by parents in my own constituency of Harlow that they are considering whether or not they can afford to take their children to school. I know they'll do everything they can, but it's incredibly difficult. The average motorist is paying £20 more now at the pumps than they were paying a year ago. So, as you say, I organised this letter. Over 50 MPs, the former leader of the Conservative Party, 3 former Secretary of States, a number of former ministers as well, MPs from across the Red Wall and the south of England, and we've asked him to either cut fuel duty or VAT on fuel, or both. I think a 5p cut would be a good starting point on top of the fuel duty freeze. It will be up to the Chancellor what he actually does, but they have been raking in billions more because of the ever-increasing cost of petrol and diesel at the pumps.
That's right, and
the tax money's come in and it's higher, so they should be able to give that back to the customer.
And he's actually got quite a lot of headroom to play with, because I understand, but correct me if I'm wrong, Robert, fuel duty represents about 58 pence per litre in tax. Every litre is fuel duty. Is that about the right number?
Yeah, if you include VAT, it's over 60%. So what happens, we're double taxed. So we pay the fuel duty and then you're taxed on the whole amount rather than the original amount before the fuel duty was put on. So we are amongst the highest taxed on fuel duty in across Europe. Interestingly, Ireland, I said in the House of Commons, they were having a wonderful St. Patrick's Day because Ireland have reduced fuel duty because of the huge costs to motorists. New Zealand have done it. France has done it. I'm sure that other countries will follow suit.
And of course,
the
greatest impact proportionally is, of course, on the least well-off in society, the lowest paid, who may, as you say, either driving to take children to school or to get to work, and it's becoming ever harder for them. And therefore, I would have thought it should be sort of one of the number one targets for the Chancellor. Because otherwise you're essentially taking money out of people's pockets and putting it into back into the Treasury at a time of such stress.
Well, you're exactly right. What annoys me with this argument is that sometimes people say you just want to support the selfish motorist, amazingly. And then I point out to them, actually, if people take bus fares, they go up because the ever-increasing cost of diesel. When you go to the supermarket to buy your food, the cost of food goes up because of the increased cost of transportation. If you believe in the National Health Service, as I do, instead of spending money on doctors and nurses, they're having to pay for ever-increasing energy costs and also fuel costs for their vehicles, as the police service, as those who use school buses for schools. So it affects all of us in very different ways, but it affects almost every person up and down the country. And the rates are horrific. I mean, I was driving around Essex, where I live, from 160, 170, 180, 190. It's just not affordable. I mean, this is not just a usual thing where people are saying, oh, the government have done the wrong measure. I mean, there is real fear out there. Real fear.
And do you think the Chancellor really understands that? It's so easy to be sort of cocooned when you're, obviously he's got an incredibly difficult and busy job, but to what extent does he really understand the pain that ordinary families are feeling up and down the country, particularly those actually who do have to drive fair distances, who live out in the countryside, villages, towns? They can't rely on public transport or just walking to work.
I hope he understands that. He's said in media interviews this morning that he has a lot of rural constituents who have explained the costs that they are facing. He's indicated that something may be done to make it easier for motorists this week. I hope very much. I'd like him to go further. I think we should do. They've given $9 billion. They spent $9 billion trying to reduce energy bills. Absolutely welcome that. The reduction in council tax, £150, and then £200 off the energy bills for most people, although you pay back £40 over 5 years. But why not get rid of the green levies, for example? That's 25% of the cost of electricity. It's a no-brainer.
All of this is the big issue of the year, apart from Ukraine, but it's all obviously interrelated. The cost of energy. Because people are struggling to afford their homes, businesses are struggling to be able to survive the huge energy increases, and then you've got these fuel prices. And again, it's not only domestic but also businesses struggling with them. I mean, the Chancellor's really got to have a major rethink, surely, and we're due to get the energy security plan, I think, from the Prime Minister. He keeps saying in the coming days, at some point, that day will arrive. Surely this needs a major rethink about being much more self-reliant on our own energy and therefore, cheaper energy.
Yes, and you've got to stop. Look, I believe absolutely we've got to care for our environment, care for our planet, 100%. We've got to stop balancing environmentalism on the backs of working people. And that is the problem. It's a lot of often the elites who are telling working people how to live their lives, what cars they should drive, what food they should eat, what boilers they should have in their houses. And all that is doing is pushing up costs for working people. Absolutely incentivize people to be green and go renewables where possible. But we also have to deal with the world as it is, as well as the world that we would like it.
That's right, because the world as it is, Robert, is that there are 25 million domestic gas boilers, and renewable energy, electricity, can't power gas boilers. So that is the world as it is. And, we've got all our own gas, and it actually creates less CO2 using our own gas, whether it's North Sea or shale gas, rather than importing gas from Russia or the Middle East.
That's exactly right. And we should be trying to get the gas and the hydrocarbons that we have whilst we move to more renewable energy. But don't say we're just going to move to renewable energy and scrap everything else, because all that happens is the costs go up for working people. The fact that the Prime Minister has to go to Saudi Arabia to ask them to turn on the taps, I don't object to that at all. But wouldn't it be much better if we were completely self-reliant and didn't need to rely on whether it was the Middle East, whether it was the Russians or whoever it may be for our energy needs?
Well, my Sunday sermon at the beginning of the show, Robert, was all about the word dependency, and it's one of my least favourite words, because if you're dependent on other nations when you're running a country, or indeed if you, as an individual, or as a business, if you're dependent on one client, then you're exposed. And at the moment, we're overexposed. Robert, thank you so much for your contribution, your thoughts there. That's Robert Halfon, Conservative MP for Harlow, Chair of the Education Select Committee. He's put forward a letter signed by some 50 Conservative MPs to the Chancellor. We'll find out in a few days the extent to which the Chancellor is in listening mode to the likes of Robert Halfon. Coming up, we are going to be talking to Sam Armstrong about what China's position is in respect of the Russia-Ukraine crisis, what that might mean for Taiwan, and whether, again, coming back to my message about dependency, whether actually we are far, far too reliant on China. Stay with us. You're listening to Tice Talk here at Talk Radio.
Bold Talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
21st century debate.
Speak once, think twice.
Talk radio. Exhalation. Conversation. Confrontation. Fine talking. Common sense. Talk radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk. We're here into the second hour. We were just listening to Robert Halfon about his proposals to reduce fuel duty for the Chancellor. Interesting tweet coming in here from, I think it's Greasel's the Word, interesting, who says, Richard, when are you going to realise that the high charges of fuel and energy are all part of Boris's and the World Economic Forum's net zero lunacy? Well, if you've been listening to me, I've been banging on about the cost of net zero, and its flawed plans and the opportunity cost of not using our own shale gas for weeks and weeks and weeks. So yes, I'm well aware. And we're now going to be moving, though, to talk about the related issues to Ukraine and the impact of China in all of this. And I talked earlier about the risk of being too dependent on things. One of which, of course, is cheap goods from China. And I've got an interesting tweet here from Sarah who says, I think we need to be watching China. They have tentacles in all areas of our lives and we depend on them way too much. Well, that certainly is my view too, Sarah. But let's now talk to Sam Armstrong, Director of Communications at the Henry Jackson Society, because we had the situation where on Friday, the President of the United States spoke to President Xi Jinping of the Chinese Communist regime about what China's stance was with regard to Russia and whether or not China would actually condemn Russia for invading a separate sovereign state. Sam, a very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us. So we heard what the President of the US had this phone call, which was well over an hour long, I think. But there's been very little information, I think, that's come out of it in terms of any detail or any conclusions of the call. I mean, in a sense, China seems to be sitting on the fence very successfully and sort of playing a long game. But is it really a case that actually China's either with the West or it's with Russia? Or can it perhaps be a mediator in this whole process?
Yeah, so I think the best analogy at the moment is China is basically the captain of the other side, and they've got on their team a left back in the form of Russia that's a little bit misbehaving, getting a little bit too feisty, and is trying to throw some punches at one of the other team's players. And we're having to be the kind of, President Biden, who's acting as sort of the captain of the West, is going over to the other team's captain and saying, look, chap, you've got a player in your team that's slightly out of control there. We're not on the same team, but you've kind of got to realise here that he's letting you down, he's letting the side down, and he's risking open confrontation.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, Sam, he's a bit more out of control. He needs a red card, if you use the team analogy, and sent off the pitch.
Yeah, well, sadly, the UN doesn't have the, perhaps good in many respects, it doesn't have the ability to send off players. So there is no arbitrator. What I would say is I don't think China's happy with Russia. It's caused huge amounts of economic disruption and upset at a time where China's own domestic problems mean it would quite like the world to be moving on and in a stable trading state. And of course, it's really relaunched the NATO Western alliance in a way that we're seeing countries like Germany finally say, oh, wowza, hang on, we really had made a mistake for several years not funding our defence.
And Sam, I'm concerned about dependency. EU nations are over-dependent on Russian gas, and that really has sort of been a massive wake-up call for everybody. We're very dependent on China for cheap goods, and we know that China, they're probably looking very, very carefully at the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia in respect of the Ukraine invasion, compared to their ambitions, essentially to take back control of Taiwan, and the extent to which what sanctions would we in the West impose on China were they to do that. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, I've talked about the possibility actually of saying to China that we would impose similar sanctions on you if you were to take over Taiwan against its will.
Yeah, so the difference between Taiwan and Ukraine, of course, is that the US has this act of Congress, the Taiwan Relations Act, that forces it to defend it. So it's not just actually that we might step in with sanctions, but it might be the case that the US actually gets militarily involved to defend Taiwan, and that would be a whole different kettle of fish.
But of course, that is, to be clear, that is actually just it's a legal obligation to provide weapons and armour as opposed to boots on the ground, isn't it?
Well, the lawyers argue over this point, actually, and the US has adopted this official policy of strategic ambiguity to say, well, it might be interpreted this way, or it just as easily might be interpreted that way. And it's definitely been one of the big factors that scared off China. But I do think what we've got to get clear moving forward with China is that, look, not only will we have this instant package of sanctions that we can snap on really quickly and strangle your economy, but actually we've got to get much better at using the big Chinese companies and big Western companies in China by putting pressure on them to send a message to China. China is very worried about these companies. And you know, the dependency cuts both ways. I mean, Li Ka-shing, this great Hong Kong magnate, owns vast swathes of the UK. So we're very dependent on him in a sense. But he also sits in the Chinese National People's Consultative Conference, so has a route to speak to the top. And what we've got to do is come up with a way of using sanctions to actually suggest to these kind of businessmen that the pressure they've got to put on is not employing fancy lobbyists and lawyers in London, but actually to send a message at home to their leaders that, you know, don't do this.
I think that's right, because actually, if we had imposed greater, faster, bigger sanctions on the Russian oligarchs earlier, they might have had some influence on President Putin, and likewise. I do think that we're so over-dependent on China, and too many businesses, you know, they haven't diversified elsewhere. But actually, maybe we need to make it completely clear through those businessmen like Li Ka-shing and others that actually real sanctions would be imposed, and that, you know, they therefore not only must they not invade Taiwan or take control of Taiwan, but actually they've got to condemn Russia properly.
Yeah, that's right. And I think actually what you've got to look at is you've got to send the message that to the Chinese magnates that you'll end up like Abramovich. You'll lose everything. Your yachts will have to go sent out to sea. You'll be forced to fly through from where you are. You'll be scurrying a lot. And I think Abramovich will forever be haunted of that picture of him sat there in Tel Aviv airport, looking pathetic, fleeing back to Russia, having lost everything. And the message we need to send to Chinese business magnates, many of whom, much like Russians, own great swathes of Belgravia, Mayfair, Chelsea, is that, you know, we will send you on your way in exactly the same way. We will seize your planes. We will seize your assets. And you know, your obligation now is, or it's in your interest now to say to your leader that, hang on, actually, not only do you need to not go further by invading Taiwan or elsewhere, but do things like stop the genocide against the Uyghurs, respect your international obligations to Hong Kong. And I met with a very senior Australian politician the other week who's told me that actually it is viewed around the world that one of the reasons why Ukraine was invaded by Russia is because it saw how weak the UK was to China over Hong Kong. I mean, we had a treaty to step in and do something. China ripped it up, and we did nothing.
Absolutely nothing.
Nothing.
It's that constant process of being seen to be weak, and therefore the bullies will and the autocrats will basically push and push ever further. To what extent do you think that actually Putin, he's starting to... I've talked about an axis of communist evil between Russia and China. Putin's trying to sell more and more gas and oil to China to reduce Putin's dependency on selling gas to the West. How significant might that be relative to the idea that we could get President Xi to essentially act as a go-between and to force Putin to back down?
Yeah, so I think China is being very careful here because it doesn't want to get drawn into this kind of axis of evil type situation, because just as dependent as we are on China, it is dependent on us. I mean, President Xi, estimates vary, but he really needs to keep growth going at a rate of 6-7% a year in order to keep the Chinese people happy, not trying to raise political complaints of their own, and in order to enrich his own political party staff. So in order to do that, he needs to keep selling more and more complex stuff to the West.
So actually, well, that's important, isn't it? So he's dependent on our custom, and that is our leverage.
That is absolutely our leverage. And look, it will hurt us. It would hit us in the short term to say, do you know what? We're not going to have any Chinese water pistols, because we need to go find somewhere else that makes water pistols or something as banal as that. And China makes an awful lot more stuff than that, not least, the phones and computers that we use. That's right.
But Sam, it's about being over-dependent. And my concern is we're over-dependent on China for these things. Sam, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your thoughts. That's Sam Armstrong, Director of Communications at the Henry Jackson Society, with his thoughts on our dependency on China. Stay with us. We're going to be going back to the issue of tax cuts or tax rises. We'll be talking to Duncan Simpson from the Taxpayers Alliance after the break. It's Tice Talk here at the home of Common Sense, Talk Radio.
Bold Talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of Common Sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Richard Tice on Talk Radio.
World headquarters of Common Sense.
Talk Radio. Listen on DAB+.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
Richard Tice. Talk Radio.
Welcome back, my friends, to Tice Talk. It's 11:32 here on Talk Radio. Keep the calls coming in, 0344 499 1000. Some great tweets here about the green levies and what I call the eco-zealots. We've got one here from Pete who says, the green levy needs to go. I'm not convinced it's needed. I agree entirely. Well, I'll tell you why it's there. It's there in order to transfer money from the poor to the rich landowners and the wealthy multinational investors who have basically paid for and invested in the wind farms, the offshore and onshore wind farms. Another one here from Pablo who says, where's that one gone? He says, that this is actually completely gone. The net zero zealots take no notice of the hardship that their haste will cause. And another one here we've got from where's this gone? That's when are you going to realise that the high charges for fuel and energy are all part of the net zero lunacy? I think everyone feels the same who's listening, that actually these levies, these costs are just way too much. Well, I'm delighted now to be joined by Duncan Simpson, who's the research director for the Taxpayers Alliance, about the prospects in this mini statement. Some are calling it almost like a mini budget, although it's not supposed to be, because of the cost of living crisis. Duncan, a very good morning to you. So a lot of pressure on the Chancellor. We've got energy prices going through the roof, fuel prices going through the roof, a lot of it based on taxes and levies. And surely, given the pain that it's causing, the Chancellor should be cutting these levies and these taxes rather than raising them. What chance do you think there is of that?
Well, obviously at this stage it's quite difficult to say. As you say, it's a spring statement, so in theory there aren't going to be big tax changes. That's generally done in the budget and then the finance bill which comes from that. Having said that, of course, the Chancellor in some of the Sunday papers was hinting, although not saying explicitly, that some things may be done on fuel duty and income tax. So a 1 pence cut in the basic rate of income tax would save households about £5 billion. In the Treasury's mind, it would cost them about 5 billion quid to do for 1 year. So that's potentially one option. But luckily, Richard, I don't think the chances are particularly good, unfortunately. Obviously, we've been calling for this national insurance increase not to be going ahead. And I mean, it's not just us, the Taxpayers Alliance, the opposition's doing it. And many backbenchers.
And he's continually resisted calls to scrap that increase. I mean, he really has absolutely set a stall that is here to stay, even though the pain that's going to cause is again amongst the most significant. Why is he being so stubborn on this? I mean, his revenues, I think I understand that his revenues are some 40 billion higher than expected because of the increase in energy prices, because of the higher inflation increasing his receipts, and that of course drags more people into the income tax net at the lower level. Why is he being so stubborn on this, rather than realising that actually if you cut taxes, you create higher growth?
Well, indeed, difficult to say. I mean, purportedly, there's been some disagreement between the Chancellor and the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is very blasé about borrowing, doesn't really care about the debt stock in the UK, which is incidentally enormous. It was very large before COVID-19 arrived, and it's even bigger now. Whereas the Chancellor apparently is much more willing to increase that particular tax rather than increasing borrowing further. Borrowing costs, of course, will be rising this year and for subsequent years, because a lot of the debt that we issue on the markets is index linked. So the level of inflation has a direct bearing on the cost, the cost of the government and ultimately taxpayers to actually service that debt. So apparently that's the main disagreement. But yes, indeed. I mean, we do know that if you cut many kind of taxes, be it business or income taxes, the kind of dynamic effects which are realised in the economy. So that could be sort of higher investment or higher investment spending, or obviously higher wages that come about through particularly cuts in income taxes, be it the main income tax or national insurance, are realised pretty immediately, and the success and the results from that are well known. So obviously it'd be very welcome if the Chancellor were to stand up on Wednesday lunchtime and announce something along those lines. But
Duncan, let's just remind ourselves, this is a Chancellor who's increased dozens of taxes. We've got the highest taxes for 70 years, the lowest medium-term growth forecast for 60 years, the highest government spending for about 50 years. And I just want to challenge you on this point that our debt is high and remind everyone, between the two world wars, our national debt was well over 50% higher than current levels, even when interest rates were actually higher. And that it was after the Second World War that there was higher growth. And that actually then the debt came tumbling down. And surely, I mean, that is the basic tenet. We've got incredibly low interest rates. For example, the government, they could make all of the Bank of England-owned QE debt like a war bond, Duncan, fix a rate of interest on it so you're not exposed to, as you rightly say, the index-linked stuff. And then actually we can grow the economy faster. I mean, surely the Tories, They tried austerity once in 2010 and we had not great growth. So why are they trying it again?
That's a very, very interesting point. I mean, obviously, yes, we can borrow at much lower rates than not even post-war years. I mean, for generations, basically, it is indeed cheap. But obviously, just because we're doing so much borrowing doesn't mean it's an optimal policy choice. I mean, there's different ways that you can issue debt. Certainly, we used to have things called consols, which are basically debt instruments which have no sort of cut-off date. Basically, just the government sort of retires them when they want to. So I suppose they could get slightly inventive with how some of this is done. But yes, I mean, let's be blunt. I mean, the picture is bleak. We've got a government which, as you say, is pushing up spending to socialist levels, basically, of various Labour governments, post-war Labour governments. A lot of ministers are again seemingly blasé about the kind of objectives, the broader objectives that the government is pursuing, even after we've got our COVID debts. I mean, obviously, this levelling up idea is, I'm not sure entirely what it means beyond spending substantially more money. And a lot of the policy choices which were decided by the government going into the 2019 election subsequent to that are still there. But the world has fundamentally changed with how much we've been spending on COVID and, of course, what's happening in Ukraine recently.
You say the picture is bleak, but it's bleak because of the policy choices of this government, when actually they could take some different policy choices. In my view, the best way to level up is to incentivise new industry in, for example, the north of England, which they promised to do with a shale gas revolution in 2017 and then bottled it. I mean, that would create far more investment and levelling up than spending government money.
Well, indeed. I mean, obviously you have these slight sort of Potemkin villages, these ruses which the government comes out with. For example, moving some of the Treasury officials up to Darlington. Now, incidentally, I mean, we obviously support quite a few more civil servants leaving London and going across the country. But I think those kind of measures are relatively sort of, skin deep in terms of the objectives behind that. You're quite right to highlight that. I mean, obviously the situation with business rates for many retailers across this country is particularly bleak. I'd be slightly apprehensive if the government were to issue something like an online sales tax as a tool of equity to sort of effectively punish some of the online retailers because high streets are declining. I mean, that's a very long-term change the same. But yes, I mean, there's numerous policy tools which the government has messed up. This government has messed up, year after year, and seemingly they're not changing track.
It's interesting. I mean, supposedly the Chancellor he always alludes to the fact that he's a tax-cutting Conservative, but I think he's increased more taxes than any other Conservative Chancellor for a very, very long time, perhaps even a generation or beyond. Why has he forgotten the basic tenets of being a Conservative as opposed to what I often call a con-socialist?
Quite. Well, I mean, it's I suppose in his slight defence, the circumstances of him arriving in the Treasury, pretty much 2 years back, were obviously exceptional. The consequences of COVID-19 for this country and many others were enormous. So I suppose you can say, to a degree, that the cards that he's been dealt in office thus far have been difficult. That said, as I was saying, some of the noises, some of the interviews that he's been giving for the Sunday papers and Sunday shows earlier today, in terms of insisting that he's indeed a tax-cutting chancellor, that in time our taxes will be cut. I mean, frankly, I'll believe it when I see it. The temptation of this government, no doubt for various reasons, to gradually increase the tax burden to an even higher burden than it already is just apparently too strong. So, I mean, I'd like to see a bit of tax-cutting radicalism from this chancellor and indeed this government more widely, but unfortunately the omens from the Treasury don't look particularly good.
It's not great, and if they continue down this path, then we're going to have lower growth and the situation would be bleak. But there is an alternative. And I believe you've got to cut taxes, you create growth, and that creates higher wages, higher tax revenues in the medium term. Duncan, thank you so much for your thoughts on that and the likelihood of what the Chancellor may do in this week's spring statement. That was Duncan Simpson, the Research Director for the Taxpayers Alliance. Lots of calls coming in. We'll take those after the break. Interesting tweet here from, who's this from? Andy. India and Africa wish they could have an industrial revolution. I presume that's actually to reduce their dependency, for example, on China and Russia. Interesting one also tweet here from Jenny in Milton Keynes, who says, I don't want to go green, but true blue. Nationalise all our assets and infrastructure given away to other countries, then have referendums on honest, transparent firms based in the UK. Well, there we are. Certainly, I believe that our critical national infrastructure should not be owned by overseas firms and individuals. It is too big a risk. It's not allowed in countries like the US and France. But give us a call, 0344 499 1000, with your thoughts, your views on dependency, on raising taxes, cutting taxes, how we create higher growth, higher wages. That's the number. Stay with us. It's Tice Talk on Talk Radio.
Bold Talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Talk Radio.
Smooth, strong, and very long.
Tell your ears to chew on this.
We think what you say.
Thoughtfully you're thinking.
The home of common sense. Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk. We're approaching the end of our second hour and we've got some calls coming in. Tracy is in Burton-on-Trent. Good morning, Tracy. How are you?
Good morning, Richard. I'm really well. It's just really about the cost of living crisis. And I, obviously, as with everybody else, are, facing an increase in my council tax bills. And just out of interest, I went back to have a look at the last accounts for our local borough council. So a borough council, about 150,000 people we're talking about. The chief executive is paid a basic salary of 130,000. On top of that, he gets other expenses, and we pay 19 grand a year for his pension. Now, I can't help feeling that somebody that earns £130,000 basic salary, which is 4 times the national average, could afford to put 19,000 in himself.
Oh, absolutely. Well, this is the same across all of civil service jobs. They get gold-plated, normally, open-ended sort of defined benefit pensions.
And he's in the year 2021, which is the last accounts we've got for. He borrowed 11 million. We have a debt in our borough council of 48.4 million, I think it was, 2021, plus 45.3 million liability for pensions.
Wow.
And I personally, so my little borough council is in debt by about 94 million.
And Tracy, do you know what is have you been notified yet what's the increase for next year for your council tax?
It's about 3 or 4%.
Right.
So it's going up. The basic bit, which excludes me parish council bit, is going up from 182 to 187. So it's just a fiver. But it's not a huge amount, but it's a fiver. But the thing that gets me is I actually think that all public sector managers earning over 60,000 a year, all of them, should be on performance-related pay.
Oh, and well, but that means you'd have to exactly that. They'd have to perform.
They would have to perform because, to be honest, let's be brutally honest, governments are the worst people in the world for spending money. The amount of wastage we have. I mean, you look at the failing NHS, the managers aren't sorting it out. You look at the Foreign Office, we aren't dealing with the refugees that are needed in Poland because they're all working from home. You look at the Home Office. They're not sorting out the refugee problem from coming across the channel. You look at the education that has totally phased our children over.
They're not. You're so right, Tracy. They're not fit for purpose. You actually bring me on to my non-job of the week, which is sort of. And you talk about government waste. I mean, it's utterly mind-blowing. And I was pretty shocked the number of diversity and inclusion managers that are being appointed by the NHS, as you say, on a salary of £70,000 plus all the pensions, plus all the extras. And it's not just one or two of them writing a guidebook. In the last 12 months, there have been 23 separate appointments for diversity and inclusion managers in the NHS.
I worked all my life in the private sector. And the private sector is, it can be brutal. I mean, I worked for Tesco for a while. The managers in Tesco were basically on a 4-month rolling contract. You failed or you weren't performing, you were out. And we just seem to have a roundabout within the public sector that, you can be bad.
Well, that's right. Tracy, you're so right. Very often, chief execs of a failing NHS trust end up as a chief exec of another one. Tracy, it's all of our money, Tracy, and too much of it is being wasted. Thank you so much for your thoughts. That's Tracy in Burton-on-Trent, who's concerned about government waste. We're going to head, I think, northeast from Burton-on-Trent to Leeds, where Anthony is patiently waiting. It is still just good morning, Anthony. Hello, how are you? What's on your mind?
Yes, good morning, Richard. Yes, I'm phoning up about the Ukraine refugees. I can't see difference between them and the Belgian refugees in 1914.
In what sense? I mean, they're all war zone refugees. Is that what you're saying, Anthony?
Yes. When the Kaiser invaded into Belgium, the Belgian refugees come to this country.
Yes, and actually,
240,000 come here.
well, that's right.
And they let them in.
Did you say 240,000?
Yes.
Yeah, and I think the reality is that the great British people want to welcome in the women and children, the Ukrainian refugees, because they know they're genuine war refugees. And also I think people know that we can help, but also that the vast majority of these, of course, want to go back to their home country, to go back to Ukraine as soon as it's safe to do so and help rebuild it.
I can't see that happening at the moment. I can't see that happening. When you've got that Putin, that madman.
Oh, for sure. No, I'm talking about when it's safe to do so. But yeah. I think the people want to be welcoming. The government's got itself into a classic Home Office bureaucratic mess and pickle.
I'm talking about in 1914. This had only had the British Empire, or some newspapers call it the evil British Empire. But we still let in them people in, Belgians in.
Well, that then was obviously a humanitarian, the right thing to do, and I think people here want to welcome genuine war refugees from Ukraine, don't you?
Yeah, I do, because they've got kids, they've got big women and children, so how come they're not allowed in?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the government is starting to let them in, but I think, are you really saying, Anthony, that they're just being too slow and bureaucratic about it?
Well, I think that somebody's pulling the government strings that they're not allowing them in.
Interesting. All right, well, Anthony...
Yeah, listen, but before, you might cut me off for good in your radio programme. They're not allowing them in because of Christians. That's what it's all about. Somebody's putting the government strings.
I think it's bureaucratic.
Belgian ones in 1914. What's the difference?
Well, I don't think there's any difference. They're war zone refugees. Anthony, thank you very much for that thought. We've just got time to go down to Bromley, where Lionel is there. Hi, Lionel.
Hello, Richard. This follows on from what Howard Cox of the Fair Fuel campaign was saying last week.
Yes.
About electric vehicles not being the only option. The fixation on electric cars makes us ever more dependent on China for the lithium-ion batteries that power them. Isn't it bad enough that so much of Europe has already made itself dependent on Russia for its gas? China now controls 80% of the market in lithium-ion batteries.
Lionel, you're right, but there's some good news that actually there's lots of lithium down in Cornwall, and recently I had the chief exec of British Lithium, and also there's a firm setting up a new lithium car battery plant in the northeast of England. So, you know, we have actually got the potential ability in coming years to change that.
Well, I hope that balances things out a bit, but it is rather concerning. However, there is an alternative that could spike China's guns. I invite you and anyone listening to type Biogas Academy onto the internet. It's in Sweden. In countries such as Sweden, motorists have the option of running their cars on biomethane gas.
Yes.
That's gas from waste, both animal and vegetable. They've been doing so for years. It's in other countries, but not here.
I tell you what, Lionel, I'll look into it and we'll discuss it, and then maybe you can call me back because I've run out of time before we have to go to the top of our... Lionel, thank you very much indeed for your thoughts. Stay with us into the third hour. It's Tice Talk on Talk Radio.
Bold Talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Mid-morning talk.
Sunday talk.
Talk Radio.
Take a chance with the Tice Man.
Talk Radio. Richard Tice.
Sunday morning devotion, there isn't a sermon.
Talk Radio's Common Sense Weekend.
Richard Tice
on Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk. Good afternoon if you've just joined us. We're into the third hour of the show. I don't know where the first 2 hours have gone. It's absolutely flown by. But we've got lots of calls and messages coming in. A great message here from Chris from Southend who said, Richard, did you just say that France does not allow foreign companies to own certain businesses? Well, yes, I did. What a joke, Chris says, because my electricity company, E.ON, is French, and also our dustmen work for a French company. What is wrong with this government? Well, that is the point. I believe in free markets, but certain things, critical national infrastructure, I believe, should actually be owned and run by companies and partly possibly by the government, if it's utilities, for example, here in the UK. That, I think, is absolutely fundamental. Otherwise, it comes back to the point you're dependent on the wrong people. Thanks for that message, Chris. Well, we now got to talk about the other big issue in the news, which is the unbelievable treatment by P&O Ferries of their workforce. And I must say, I am no great fan of some of the unions, particularly the Rail and Maritime Transport Workers Union, who of course are responsible for some of the incredibly disruptive strikes on things like the London Underground. It takes something for a big corporate firm to make the RMT union look like the good guys. And that is essentially what has happened with this absolute catastrophic mishandling of what they wanted to do in terms of change things in their business. I mean, the idea to me that you can just fire a whole bunch of staff and then replace them with another group of people doing exactly the same jobs in exactly the same place, in this case, i.e. on a ship, for a fraction of the wages, it just feels to me that is completely against all of our most basic employment laws with regard, for example, to redundancy and TUPE. But maybe I'm wrong, and that's why I want to talk to the employment lawyer Ronnie Fox from specialist firm Fox and Partners about this. Ronnie, very good afternoon to you. Thanks for joining Tice Talk and welcome. So, what is the real situation here? There's sort of suggestions that they were employed on overseas contracts and sort of tax havens or whatever. But surely, fundamentally, most of these staff live here in the UK. A lot of their work is here in the UK, and therefore they should be work and operate under UK laws.
Richard, good afternoon. I think your instinct is right. It is appalling. And I have seen no evidence that the workers concerned are not protected by UK employment law. And if they are protected by UK employment law, then they've been treated in the most dreadful way. There's possibly a criminal sanction because, so far as I know, no notice was given to the government of the scale of these redundancies.
Yes, because you're supposed to consult, aren't you?
Redundant, you've got to give notice.
You've got to give notice, and you've got to consult on major redundancies above a certain number of people.
And you've got to consult the individuals concerned. You've got to establish that there's no alternative. And it looks as though P&O did none of those things.
But they surely are advised by their own lawyers and very well-paid senior executives. I mean, they can't be stupid, but they do seem to have acted in either deliberately or very foolishly in this way.
The only explanation that I've come up with is that they worked out the cost of doing what they've done and worked out the cost of going through the proper process and came to a conclusion that it will be cheaper to do what they've done. I take some comfort from one fact, and that is the unions have told employees not to discuss this matter.
Right.
Why do I take comfort from that? It suggests that there are negotiations going on. It suggests that these workers are going to get some form of compensation. Though I don't know how much, and I don't know if they'll get their jobs back, any of them.
But actually, for me, I'm not sure that the extent of the compensation is enough. I think this comes down to an absolute fundamental principle of UK law. And the government actually, if it wants to, has some significant levers at its disposal. For example, I understand that the new employees have got to be trained on these ships, and they've then got to have a new licence approved by the Maritime Coast Guard Agency. Well, that agency could just say, we're not going to grant those licences, at which point P&O have got a massive problem.
Exactly. And one hopes that they took that into account, and maybe they've decided that they just don't want to be in that business long term. They want to wind it down.
But in which case, the normal course of events is that you say to your staff, we need to go through a major restructuring, or you put a division, you put the company on the market to be resold. If you can't make a good fist of it, then perhaps someone else can. But I just think this is absolutely important. There are, of course, other things the government could do to the parent company, which is DP World, which owns some major ports on the Thames in London and also at Southampton, that they're hoping that would gain free port status. I mean, the government's got real levers here if it wants to use them.
It's got levers. The question is whether pulling on those levers would cause Britain more damage than not pulling on them. And that is a government decision.
What sort of damage are you thinking? What if those routes are essentially not serviced where they've got exclusive use of a route?
Well, going back to the ferries situation, some of the victims were passengers. And if DP World is not allowed to operate the ports, many of their customers will be those who suffer in the short term at least. And that's what I'm thinking of.
Yes, okay, but London Gateway is not a passenger port. I think it's just a container port. I think an incredibly modern and highly automated port where the DP World have invested huge amounts into. So actually losing the potential free port status would be significant.
It would be very significant, very significant.
But obviously Southampton, as you say, is different. That is a massive passenger terminal and port as well. But as a parent company, yes, you can understand if your business is not making money, you've got to make some changes. But there's a proper professional, lawful way of doing that, as opposed to just ripping up the rule book and saying you're all fired and we're going to rehire some people on a fraction of the wages, way below the minimum wage.
There is a proper professional and moral way of handling redundancies, and I've advised many employers on the right way to do it. And this is not the right way.
Absolutely right. So what do you think happens from now? You think there might be some negotiations going on, but have you got any indication, Ronnie, that the government may use these levers?
Well, the government has said that they're taking legal advice, and that they are extremely unhappy. And I think the government needs to do something about it. Now, I'm not a political advisor. I was thinking about the damage to the supply chain, which could end up hurting a lot of innocent consumers. And I'm very interested in your point about major strategic companies being foreign owned. I've got a book on my shelf called Is Britain for Sale? And there are a very large number of companies which are extremely important to the economy that are foreign owned. And provided they play according to the rules, there's no problem. But they didn't play according to the rules in this case.
It's Ronnie, it's something I've spoken about on a number of occasions. I think it's absolutely wrong that we've allowed just a complete free-fall of the ownership of companies that are strategically important to the UK. And I'll be talking about that more. Ronnie, thank you so much for your thoughts. We'll be coming back to it and we'll be watching it very closely. Just before we go for the break, I think I've got time for one call from Pepe, who is in London. Good afternoon, Pepe.
Oh, good afternoon to you. Hi. Just listening to your guest earlier on. I forgot the guy's name. The MP, was it? From
Robert Halfon, yes.
That's the one, yeah. Well, I sort of get my clothing made in China. I do sportswear for ladies and men's. And I get all my stuff made in China. And when I asked one of my suppliers this week, actually, I said to her, what about your government? Are you going, are they going to support, Russia in the invasion of the Ukraine? So she went, oh, well, yes, I hope so. I went, what?
Wow.
And she was all for it. I said, so, well, cancel me off your list. She said, oh, no. I said, no, sorry. I said, I'm not going to give you my money that you're going to pay your taxes to your government, which will fund Russia's.
Good for you. Good for you, Pepe. That's fantastic. So where are you going to take your supplier business instead? Still in China or elsewhere?
No, India now, Pakistan.
Very sensible.
Which I've got links there. I've already spoken to them about 2 months ago. And the guy, he's waiting. And I thought, I've had the supplier. So, I just think it's wrong that this government don't, send out these messages to us as the suppliers that we buy from China.
Of course it should. I mean, you've taken the bull by the horns, which is fantastic, Pepper, but the government needs to make it very clear that China's stance is totally unacceptable.
They are so slow. The government is very, very slow. If China is going to support Russia, then what they should be doing is getting onto the Chinese and seizing their stuff way before it kicks in.
And making it unacceptable. So I've been saying, Pepe, that we should say, China, if you support Russia militarily or if you don't condemn it, then we could impose sanctions on you similar to the sanctions that be imposed on Russia, and that would start to hurt China. But it does mean other firms have got to do exactly what you've done, Pepe, which is take your business elsewhere.
I did it this week. I've done it this week. I mean, I do lots of, sportswear. I've done other bits and pieces, and I just think it's wrong that my money's going to be given
Pepe,
to the taxman.
you are, in my view, you're a shining example. You're leading them from the front, and I'm hoping that others will follow. Pepe, thank you so much for that great call about whether or not he's still prepared to deal with Chinese suppliers if they're going to support or not even condemn the Russian activities. Keep your calls coming in, 0344 499 1000. Coming up after the break, we are going to be talking again, hopefully, to Andre Walker, who we tried to talk to earlier, about what he's doing in the humanitarian. And we've got a text in here. Richard, are you able to talk about the Net Zero conference that was cancelled due to the threats that we had? This is worrying for free speech. Yes, we are going to be talking about that from 12:30 onwards with another pro-shale gas campaigner, Lorraine Allenson. She actually wrote a book about the threats and abuse she got a few years ago. Really interesting, which I'm in the middle of reading. So stay with us. You're listening to Tice Talk. All of that is coming up on Talk Radio.
Bold Talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Talk Radio. Open discussion. Healthy debate. Talk Radio. Listen. Digest. Repeat. Understand.
Smart people, smart speaker, smart TV.
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk. We are well into the third and final hour of my show. It's been busy, lots of calls and messages coming in. One here from Active Convo regarding a conversation earlier. The Belgian refugees who came to the northeast to work in munitions factories in the First World War, they had their own village. They were mostly injured soldiers and most went back, but not my grandfather, who was one of them. Well, there we are. I think that's the point, isn't it? As I said, we should take, of course, Ukrainian refugees, and the vast, vast majority will want to go back to their home country, Ukraine, as and when it is safe to do so. In the meantime, actually, there's a huge amount of humanitarian effort and work going on. And my next guest, I hope, is with us. Andre Walker has already been to the Ukrainian border once, helping, and I think is planning to go back again. Andre, good afternoon to you.
Hello, I think this connection's working slightly better now. The gremlins have gone.
Excellent. Yeah, we need to get rid of the gremlins. So you've been to the Ukrainian border once, haven't you, Andre? And now you've got new plans to help even further with vehicles and things. What are you up to?
Yeah, so essentially what goes on the Ukrainian border, by the way, people sometimes complain that I'm giving away operational details. I'm not. The Russians can see what we're up to. What we do is we bring 40-ton Arctic lorries from anywhere. That might be Dundee, Dusseldorf, Brussels, and in our case, principally Gloucester, which is where our base is. We take those 40-ton trucks and then we unload them into, first of all, the refugee camp, which is obviously quite a small operation. And you mentioned about refugees, by the way. The vast majority of refugees are young women in their 20s and 30s with children. Their husbands have been conscripted to the military. So they want to go to their nearest relative to Ukraine. Now, for some of them, that will be Slough. For the vast majority, it will be Poland. So I just warn people who think they're going to take lots of Ukrainian refugees. So obviously, we supply the refugee centre, but the really important thing is to get the aid actually into Ukraine. And what we've got is a team of local drivers who deliver to a specific place. So they know the Tice family have got 10 people in their bunker and so on and so forth, and they know what items they need. So what we're doing today, and obviously I've been up all night worrying about this, Alistair Chambers and Tony Hercombe, and I hope they'll be in your prayers today, are dropping off our first armoured aid vehicle. Because what we found with these delivery drivers was they were making the dangerous journey across Ukraine in Renault Clios. And of course, it doesn't make any sense from a safety point of view, or indeed from a capacity point of view, to do that. So we've got 100 armour-plated vehicles that we can get in the UK. You know how nobody uses cash anymore?
Yes.
We've got those. And we're getting body armour for the drivers as well. So we are now really pushing forward on the logistics in terms of getting things to Ukraine.
That's absolutely fantastic. So these essentially are repurposed armour-plated vehicles, form a sort of, I guess, the likes of sort of Securicor cash vehicles that we used to see, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and we're being given them very cheaply by these companies. And of course, the thing is about the vehicles, Richard, they're not wrecks. They're just not used anymore because there's not as much cash going around. But what they have to do is they have to retrofit them so they can withtake landmines and IEDs. I mean, I have to say, the principal reason why we've got them at this stage is the boost in capacity that they bring, because there's not a lot of small arms fire in the areas of Ukraine that we're delivering to, but that may change in the fullness of time. And of course, the other element is, Richard, we can't just give you a sat-nav and send you off into Ukraine. See, these people have got local knowledge. They're the sort of people that you might find as local councillors in the UK. And if we lose any of them, it's not merely a tragedy, it's a real operational problem. But I'll tell you the concern that we've got. Vladimir Putin said that he would hit any weapons supplies coming from the West. Now, I don't know what he thinks of the operation that we're running, but 5 or 10 miles away, there was a cruise missile strike on a depot. Now, that is a significant concern to us that this man who's increasingly desperate might attempt a cruise missile strike on one of our depots. Of course, it is worth pointing out that we open our depots and close them normally within 12 hours for security reasons. And so if you were to hit one, another one would immediately reopen. But obviously, it's still a huge concern.
So, I mean, incredible bravery from the drivers and the logistics organisers, the loaders of your vehicles. But I guess you're sort of almost learning on the job hour by hour. And then I guess the demand is changing and shifting hour by hour.
Yes, absolutely. And people will be dropping off at Polish centres right across the country. The thing is, we get effectively a shopping list of things they need. So at the moment, it's please do not send any clothes. The reason is we're just not at that stage of the whole thing. The Ukrainian economy has collapsed, but then again, people have still got the clothes. They don't need to change them yet. And then similarly, the things like, please can we get body armor and for the drivers? Let me tell you something. The weight of the logistics that are going into Ukraine. Let me give you an example. There is no professional body armor for sale now in Europe, Africa, the Middle East, or Australasia, or indeed South America. The only stuff now is being manufactured in the United States of America.
Wow.
There are no second-hand vans in Poland, Romania, Moldova, or Hungary. So we're having to bring the vans over. So the amount of stuff that's going in is absolutely extraordinary. And once again, the concern is that Vladimir Putin thought that Ukraine would collapse. What we are doing is ensuring Ukraine does not collapse. And I think in his twisted mind, he may see that as a legitimate military target. That is a real worry for me.
Of course. And in a sense, it sounds like that people and these humanitarian routes and what you're doing, actually, you're preparing for a long war of attrition, potentially of sort of infinite duration. And that's my fear, is that Putin his forces are basically sort of literally stuck in the mud themselves with their own logistics problems, and that therefore he fires ever more brutal, fearsome, hideous weapons, potentially chemical weapons, in order to try and grind Ukraine into the dust.
Absolutely, and let me give you a couple of examples. The Polish guys who man our depots are extremely nervous about Britain and indeed the rest of Europe forgetting about them. So what they do is they ensure that every driver has to sign out the aid that they take. And you think, isn't that a bit of a waste of time at this stage? The reason is they do not want footage in the Western world of aid being stolen, so we don't donate again. So they're really obsessed with making sure that everything comes across as extremely above board. But certainly the concern in Poland is that things are going to go on for a significant amount of time. And look, we have heard people in Britain go on and on and on about Ukrainian refugees coming to Britain. They're not going to come. Poland itself needs to dig in. I think they're saying they're going to need another 30 primary schools in Krakow opening now. So that is a major problem. And one of the worries I've got in this country is that people are just going to believe that the solution to this is to move people over.
And I guess, Andre, we've got no idea the sort of suggestions, the numbers of refugees who've left Ukraine is now well over 1.5 million, but it could be 3 million, it could be 5 million in the coming months.
Yeah, what we're tending to find is this. You will see the refugee centre, but of course, these people are just going to be there. They want to sleep because they've been in the queue at the border for 25 hours. But what they will do is they will go on to their relatives. We're tending to find the people that have got no relatives to go to are staying in Ukraine. And also, I think there is a significant concern about sex crime. It tends to be younger women that leave. I mean, the Chechen irregulars are absolute animals. These are people who failed the vetting to get into the Chechen army. And that's not a high bar, right? So those are the people that are tending to leave, and they're tending to go to their relatives. Richard, they tend to turn up in ordinary cars, normal clothes. It's just
it's going to be ongoing. Andre, I'm going to have to leave it there, but keep up the good work. It sounds extraordinary what you're doing. Great ideas and incredible bravery. That's Andre Walker setting out just some of the plans that he's working on with his teams and colleagues in order to make a contribution towards the humanitarian effort into Ukraine. Stay with us. After the news, we're going to be talking to Lorraine Allinson about intimidation and bullying here and the impact on free speech regarding the net zero agenda and shale gas. Stay with us. It's Tice Talk on Talk Radio.
Bold Talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Richard Tice on Talk Radio. Common Sense Radio for common sense people.
Talk Radio. Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
Richard Tice.
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk. We are into the last half an hour of my show. We've still got calls and messages coming in, and we're now going to be talking about the net zero agenda and shale gas and the influence of the bullies. Yes, the eco-zealots and their impact on free speech. But firstly, let me just read this tweet out to you. This is extraordinary from Adam, who says, the Chancellor clearly faces difficult decisions in his spring budget, but the net zero agenda should be seen as a help, not a hindrance, in supporting families. I'm not sure what planet Adam is living on, but let me remind you, Adam, that our electricity bills have about a 25% levy on them in order to pay the subsidies to the rich landowners and the wealthy multinational foreign investors of the wind farms so that they can make lots and lots more money at the expense of the poorest in our society. So how does that help ordinary British families in being able to pay their energy bills? And we're just at base camp. We're at Everest base camp of the net zero cost mountain. Trust me, this is going north and fast. And that's why we should be self-reliant on energy. That's why we should be using not only North Sea gas, but also the treasure under our feet that I've talked about, i.e. the shale gas, trillions of pounds worth. But of course, it's not easy because I just launched 10 days ago a new campaign, Vote Power, Not Poverty. We want to have a debate about the cost of net zero, a debate about using our treasure, our shale gas. But sure enough, the bullies and the zealots, not only did they intimidate the venue owner, and I saw some of the threats and the intimidation, but also actually the Labour Party bullied one of our speakers, threatening to withdraw the whip if he had the temerity to speak at this cross-party event. So I thought, well, who better to speak to than Lorraine Allenson, who was very much supportive of shale gas a few years ago and was also a recipient of this sort of intimidation. Good afternoon, Lorraine. Thanks for joining me. Great to see you. Tell us a little bit about the excitement and the intimidation and the bullying that you received, because you ended up writing a book about it, which I'm halfway through.
Well, it's interesting because I've had 8 years of bullying and intimidation. Now, it still goes on to this day because I stood up in favour of shale gas. And initially, when I did stand up in favour of it, I just thought that, well, I would put my point of view across and they could put their point of view across and all would be hunky-dory. What I hadn't realised was how vile and vicious they can be. And once they discovered that I had formed a group in favour, Rydale, a group in favour of gas in Rydale, which is where I live, they targeted my family. They put pictures of my great niece and nephew who are 5 and 8 online with abuse. I mean, this is children. And as soon as that happened, I knew that I was dealing with some very evil characters. They also cut off my broadband. And by doing that, it was a small local company that actually supplied my broadband, had done for years. And he wrote a letter terminating my contract, giving me only 7 days' notice. And that he wrote it at the exact time I was speaking in favour of the planning application for the shale gas well. But he sent it the next day. But what he hadn't realised was it included the time he'd written it, the draft, at the exact time as I was speaking. So in 7 days' time, they cut off my broadband, tracing about it, and the Ofcom and the Ombudsman.
We've just lost your connection, I think, Lorraine.
And they all washed their hands of it. It was too complicated. It should go to court. Sorry. Yes, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're
Hello,
back.
Can you hear me?
You're back on, Lorraine. Keep going.
Right.
So this is just a relentless campaign of intimidation. Tell us about were these local people in your community, or actually were they people from far away?
It was a mixture. It's a mixture. You get a lot of bullying and intimidation from what I call professional protesters, but you also had locals that were often very far left wing. I mean, one of them in particular, the woman was dreadful. She said that she linked me to a crime number, which was fake, eventually against me. And I went to the police and they said, well, it's a fake number. And they suggested I did an FOI on myself with the police to see what on earth. And there was nothing against me there of any criminal description. And she didn't just do it on social media. She sent it to official bodies saying that she had this crime number as if I was a criminal. And it's been outrageous. And my business has been targeted too. Sorry, we've got a bad line.
Yeah,
hello, can you hear me?
Just about, Lorraine. We are struggling with the line. But finally, I just want to catch up with whether or not actually this intimidation, did it cease when there was a moratorium on fracking, on shale gas in 2019, or has it continued since then?
Only briefly. It continues to this day. They target my business and give it 1-star reviews and give it bad reviews. I spoke at the Tory conference on Friday night, and because I spoke there, I knew that I would be a target, and I had to have, a private security protection officer to come with me outside afterwards to take me to a taxi, just to make sure I was safe. Eco-zealots are dreadful.
Lorraine, unbelievable that it's still going on. Well, certainly we're feeling the same in terms of the intimidation and the threats we've got. Lorraine, the line's not very bad, but thank you very much for those thoughts. And no doubt we'll speak again, because I think actually there is a real mood change here, and there's a recognition that we need to be self-reliant on energy, and that we could have much, much cheaper energy if we use our own shale gas. And not only would it be much cheaper, but also, actually, it's much more sustainable. It'll save hundreds of millions of tons of CO2, because actually, if you bring in imported gas, you create about 4 times as much CO2 liquefying it and then revaporising it, rather than using our own treasure. But that was Lorraine Allinson, who was a pro-shale gas campaigner, and her thoughts. I think this is a critical national debate, and the joy of a democracy is that actually you should be able to have a difference of opinion, you should be able to discuss things, debate it, and the more you do that in a respectful way, the more you're likely to end up at the right answer. Got an interesting message here. I think it's a tweet coming from Jeanette, who says, I'm asking how net zero can help the cost of living pressure. I had an air source heat pump installed last year. My energy costs are only about 15% higher than last year. Compare that with the gas price rises. Well, yes, but hang on. If we'd used our own shale gas, we would have cheaper gas, not more expensive. So you've accepted you're paying 15% more than you otherwise would. You've also presumably had to spend a lot of money installing a new heat pump. And of course, air source heat pumps are quite noisy. And that's fine if you want to do that. But if you've got 25 million domestic gas boilers that are perfectly decent, why should we all have to replace them? And I just remind everybody that electricity does not power gas boilers. It doesn't work. The idea that you can just keep building more renewables and think that's going to solve the problem is for the birds. But give me a call, 0344 499 1000, or tweet us at Talk Radio with your thoughts, your views. We're taking some calls before the end of the show. It's Tice Talk here at Talk Radio.
Bold Talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Talk Radio.
It's not all bad news.
Beware of sharp comment.
I listen to Talk Radio.
A national treasure.
Plain talking radio.
23 and a half hours a day.
Talk Radio.
The home of common sense.
Welcome back to Tice Talk, the last part of the show before I hand over at the top of the hour to the legendary Bob Mills. Just before we go to a call, a quick message here from Heather, who says, Richard, isn't this level of intimidation and threat something the police should investigate? Well, as we know, if you try and get the police to do something at the moment, you're not really getting much joy. And this sort of intimidation, it's really hard to prove, but it's just a bit scary, a bit frightening. And it really does affect people. Anyway, let's go to Basingstoke, where Simon is patiently waiting. Hi, Simon.
Yeah, hello, Richard. I'm not surprised that the eco zealots have affected you in a negative way. But I do think it's about time we started challenging them as to the consequences of if they got everything they asked for. Everybody's up in our... Go ahead, sorry.
They'd never be satisfied, would they?
Well, they'd never be satisfied, but what's the true consequences of it? The true consequences of it is everybody in the developed world will probably go back to a living standard they enjoyed, say, about 1900. Everybody in the developing world will face mass starvation because they are reliant on fertilizers, transport systems, all of which are powered by fossil fuels. So is saving the planet worth killing 500 million people, forcing them to starve?
I mean, the reality is...
Because that's literally the consequences of what they wish us to do.
It's impoverishing people in countries that go down this route. Of that, there's no doubt. And they seem to forget that climate change has existed for the last million years and will exist for the next million years. You're absolutely right, Simon. It's a total impoverishment. And I just think we've got to stop it.
Well, and also, if we are going to start it, let's start with the things that don't matter. Ban private aircraft, private jets, ban super yachts.
There you are.
Ban luxury cars.
You know, Simon.
Let's face it. That's something that wouldn't affect the ordinary person. But why are we starting there? Why is that where we finish, not where we start?
Well, there you are. You know, of course, that would never happen. Simon, I'm just going to try and squeeze in a couple of other calls. Thank you very much. Keep listening to the show. I'm going to head to London, where Robert is there.
Morning, Richard.
Good afternoon, Robert.
Good afternoon. Sorry, yes. That was a great the sermon thing. I love it. The music at the beginning, wonderful, lovely little idea.
Oh, thank you. Right, that was a new one this year. This week, we'll keep it going.
I think you should. Look, there's a much bigger story here that we keep being told. Putin evil, all of Ukraine good. There's more to this. Just like the First World War, there was more. There's a backstory. The Second World War. When we went into Iraq, the weapons of mass destruction. Just this week, we have finally the New York Times conceding, and the BBC, of all people, conceding that Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, was being paid by the Ukrainian oil and gas company, and he's received money from Chinese companies as well, and various other elites globally, and it's all a bit shady, and it's being investigated as we speak. I will remind you that Trump was impeached the second time because he called the Ukrainian president and said, please give us the evidence that there's been wrongdoing and corruption in the Ukraine. And immediately he was impeached for that. There's a lot more going on here, which impacts everyone.
And in a sense, Robert, I mean, there's always two sides to a story. There's always a lot more going on. And in a sense, no country's perfect, least of all our own. I mean, you only got to look at what I believe is corruption of the honours system and the peerage system here in the UK.
Absolutely. It's disgraceful. Where it gets dangerous, Richard, and you've seen this, but there's a lot of people who are still living in the woke world of, look, let's be honest. If Putin can shell civilians, which I'm sure that does happen, right? I do believe that happens. I don't think he wants to. It doesn't look good, but he wants to win that war. If he can do that, he's perfectly capable of funding a think tank here and there to convince everyone that the weather's going to kill us all in 30 years if we don't completely kneecap ourselves in terms of our usage. And that does, these think tanks have managed to convince a whole swathe of people in our country that us just existing, breathing out CO2 is a crime and a sin. It is very dangerous because what you then end up doing is disrupting supply lines, food chains. My friend is an agricultural economist. He's been to the wheat fields in Ukraine and Russia and India, actually. They sell intelligence to big companies around the world. The food chain next year is massively being disrupted. In their opinion, they're saying sanctions are going to hurt us a lot more than it's going to hurt Putin, because we are going to end up with stratospheric food prices. So, we've got to just calm down. Of course, it's emotional to watch refugees, but we cannot have energy at the prices that they're at. It doesn't mean I don't care about the planet.
We absolutely do, but there's smarter ways to reduce emissions by using our own energy. I keep saying, if we use our own gas, we're actually going to be more sustainable. We're going to save CO2, and then there's some wonderful new technology, carbon capture, where you could actually start to capture the CO2 emitted from gas-fired power plants.
Of course.
And you could then use the reverse of the drilling techniques to extract shale gas and actually put the CO2 back into the ground 2 or 3 miles down, and you've then got an incredibly sort of neutral type scenario. That's the sort of technology where we can have a real win-win. We can reduce CO2 emissions. We can still have cheap, affordable energy that's owned by us all. Robert, I'm going to try and squeeze in one more caller, but thank you so much for your thoughts. Keep listening. Keep coming up with the ideas and the calls. That was Robert from London with his thoughts. There's always two sides to a story, and yes, and in a sense, none of us are perfect, least of all us here in the UK. I think we've got Susan finally in Exeter. Susan, are you there?
Oh, good afternoon, Richard. I know we have to move quickly because you're busy, but my main concern now is I think Putin is very angry because he's not having an easy time with this war as he thought he would be. He's losing a lot of men. He's losing tanks and other artillery weapons and stuff. He's lost helicopters and fighter planes.
He has indeed.
I'm quite, actually, it makes me sound awful, but I'm quite pleased because he's doing such a horrible thing. You've got people screaming on the streets with their legs blown off, and, it's absolutely appalling. And, it's unbelievable, Richard, what he's doing. He's so cold-hearted. But I think my worry now is that he'll release... He's angry. He's sacked several...
He's angry, and yes, and
yeah.
It's
He's angry, and I'm frightened he'll release. I'm talking quickly because I need to. Because I'm frightened he will release chemical warfare. That's my biggest fear with him.
We all are. You're absolutely right, Susan. We're all concerned about that. That's Susan in Exeter with her concerns about the risk of chemical weapons. Heaven forbid, over and above the ever more aggressive weapons that Putin is using in the Ukraine. Thank you, Susan. Thank you to all of the callers, the messages and the tweets that have been coming in. And there is one final tweet here. But before I talk about that, thanks to my wonderful production team, as ever, this last tweet, I think our next presenter will enjoy. Mr. Bob Mills is up next on Talk Radio. I've got my cuppa ready, Bob. Love you, #1 fan from Stephanie. There we are. Good afternoon to you. How are you, Bob?
Good afternoon to you. Well, lovely show. Isn't it fascinating? Because all the experts are wonderful and they know what they're talking about. But when the actual public call in, you get a real sense that people are much brighter than perhaps the media gives them credit for.
I mean, well, I always say never underestimate the common sense and the gut instinct.
Because people live their lives and they know there's always two sides to a story.
Yeah, of course.
If you've got a family, you know that. There are different factions at play.
We all understand that.
Fascinating callers. I love the guy with the business in China because he was an example of what a lot of people are going to have to do. You're going to have to stand up and be counted.
Stand up, and he's made an early call.
Yeah.
What's coming up this afternoon?
Well, we've got a fabulous book. I'm very happy to be starting with by John Davis. It's called Waterloo Sunrise, and it's a history of London from sort of Thatcher, up to Thatcher, basically, from the 50s, 60s up to the Thatcher period when it changed. And we're based in London. We're not London-centric, but it is the capital city. It's a very interesting book about it. Then we got some art. We've got Lubberland, and we finished with live music with Jack Francis.
Fantastic. That will be fascinating. Well, I look forward to that history of London in the 50s, 60s and 70s, just before my time. But
Oh, bless you. Yeah, you'd have been a young man there. Just out of school.
A very young man at that time, but it is a great city. But of course, we're a nationwide channel. International channel. We've had callers from all over the world. Thanks very much to everybody for listening. Thanks to my great production team. You've been listening to Tice Talk. It is, of course, the same time, same place next week. It's been Tice Talk here on Talk Radio.
Bold Talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.